We are now live on YouTube with the June 20th meeting of the Node.js Release Working Group.
Hey everyone, I'm working from the agenda issue, which is number 460 in the release repo. And we've only got 3 items on the agenda this week, but there might be some other things to discuss afterwards. And the first on the list is a proposal for changes to LTS. And I think this is an issue, Miles, you opened. I don't know if you want to give some background to the people that may not have seen this.
Yeah, so this is something we've been talking about for a while. Currently, the way that LTS works is a release comes, it has 6 months as an active release, then 18 months. 6 months is a current release, 18 months is active LTS, and then 12 months of maintenance. And the general sentiment, and this isn't 100% the case, but it's that like you get kind of monthly releases is the cadence we're aiming for during active, and then no set number of releases in maintenance. We also, up until now, and this is something that can be revisited, but up until now, we generally have tried to avoid doing some of our minor releases during maintenance unless it was necessary due to a security release. But some recent changes to NAPI have had us revisiting that. I think that is a separate conversation. But what's being proposed in this change is swapping the timeframes for active release, active LTS, and maintenance, so that active LTS would only be 12 months and then maintenance would be 18. One of the benefits of this would be having less releases to maintain at the same time. So currently with the 18-month window, we end up having 2 LTS releases at the same time that are inactive. And that's a lot of work. Whereas if we had 12 months for active, there never actually would be 2 overlapping active LTSs. The older LTS will still be supported for another 1.5 years after it moves to maintenance, but it would significantly reduce the maintenance burden on this team, and I think as well more accurately reflect the release cadence that we really can do that late in the release cycle of a release. So that's the high-level overview.
Cool. Any thoughts from anyone? I personally would be +1 on this based on seeing the release cadence and things like that and what we can keep up with and what we can keep backporting in terms of features, and this would relieve some of that. So
I guess one question would be for the group to think about would be, I don't believe that we should change this for 10 because 10 is already, in LTS, but I think that we should make a decision and make it clear through the decision before we start the active LTS of 12.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess no one's been like -1 on it. I guess we could try and PR the change to the README. I think we've documented this in the README somewhere. And then use approvals on that as a way of gaining consensus on it.
That seems very reasonable. We'll also want to check the main repo or other places that may cross-reference the time frame.
Okay. Sure.
I think I saw something on the website that
As well.
duplicated, yeah.
Yes.
Or was going to.
Okay. So we need to round up all of those.
Yeah.
But, okay. I'll post in there what we're going to do after the meeting. And defining a word for all current releases. I think this has been on the agenda for quite a long time, actually.
Could I add an addendum to that last one?
Sure.
Miles, well, I'm absolutely in favor of Miles' suggestion. I thought that there was an item in play to discuss what he said wasn't going to get discussed as part of that issue, which is basically not pulling all the semvers out and then releasing them in batches. Is there, Bethany, didn't you have a proposal to do that somewhere? Or is that?
I think Ruben opened, I'm not sure where it is.
Okay. Well,
It kind of comes under this proposal, the stop specifying patch or minor for LTS releases, because in that case, we'd always be pulling back all of the minors that have landed on master.
right. Okay, but that's not part of the agenda. Okay, cool.
We can add it to the agenda, Sam.
I'd like to, I think it'd be worth talking about sometime, or maybe the conversation's still going on in GitHub.
It's
I mean,
not an issue.
we can definitely dig into this. I have some very specific feelings about the proposal as it came. I have some concerns about it, so it'd be good for us to at least talk about it and have it on the record.
Okay. Let me see what the other. Okay, so the next two won't take too long, so we can probably go ahead and talk about this one now. So there's been a lot of discussion, including at the Collaborate Summit, about whether we pull back all features, all minors and patches to make it easier for us to backport things in future, or we be more picky and backport less of them, but the result of this is that we get more conflicts because we've got a bigger delta between the V10 branch and master, or whichever two releases it happens to be. So I don't know if, Miles, you want to share your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a little complicated. So in my experience, and it could, and I think that we should go out and do a little bit of user research for this. Don't just take my word for it. People want less Semver minors in LTS releases. These people, including but not limited to downstream Linux distributions running their own LTSs, as well as platforms running their own serverless operations. Some examples to this include platforms like Amazon Lambda. This has actually been a pain point that I've seen people experience in managing client libraries and node libraries that claim to target like Node 8 or Node 10. But these platforms can end up taking quite a longer amount of time to upgrade to Semver minors because they're generally viewed as less stable than Semver patch updates. And so if you go and look at various runtimes and the latest version, you will notice that they tend to be on the latest patch, but might be a couple Semver minors behind. I am genuinely concerned that if we switch to this model of backporting, that we will end up more or less having every release be a Semver minor. And from an LTS perspective, I view that as a burden on external teams who are adopting our LTS releases.
Yep.
That's one of them. The other one is there's a premise here that landing things in order will make things simpler. And to be blunt, I am not convinced of that premise. A lot of code touches different subsystems. The second that we have to make a patch that's specific for a release line, we already are off on our own history. I am not convinced that simply landing things in the right order will significantly simplify or reduce the burden of backporting. A lot of the burden of backporting is having to go through and audit every single commit. When I've gone and done these LTS releases in the past, you have to go through hundreds of commits. The biggest difference between that and current is you don't need to audit every single commit. So even for a commit that lands cleanly, it takes 3 to 4 times as much time as a current release because you have to do far more due diligence. So I know where these suggestions had come from in the summit, and I unfortunately missed that session, and I wish I had been able to express these feelings earlier. But I am concerned that this process would actually degrade the value of LTS, and I'm not convinced of the benefit of it.
Okay. One thing maybe is that I know Ruben is trying to backport majors to LTS, well, currently Node 12 to current at the moment with compatibility patches to see if that helps the conflicts and things like that. So I guess we could see how that goes, and if it is positive, maybe revisit this. But I don't know what the actual next steps on this would be, other than us going in and changing our release schedule to be all minors. I'm not really sure how we can trial it without just saying we're going to do it. So
I have some thoughts on this. I mean, so I don't have as much experience as Miles as you or Bethany, obviously, in backporting things, but I did have an interesting experience trying to get TLS 1.3 back to 10.x. And I found that the order, I mean, basically there's conflicts, they'd fix conflicts in files. Often there were conflicts because just some of their dependent, commits had not been merged in. So I'd go back, find what it depended on, cherry pick that in, then cherry pick TLS 1.3. The conflict would disappear on the file, life is good. Go on to the next file, figure out what it depended on. And as I did that, I started to realize that moving back along those dependencies, because they were being cherry picked in as needed to fix conflicts in particular files, were starting to land in different orders. And I ended up in this situation where I couldn't figure out the order that all the old commits had to land in order to stop making a huge mess every time. So it gave me this, it's only one experience, though it did kind of cut across a bunch of the code base, but it gave me the very strong impression that the order of commits landing, it can be like not so painful at first, but it has this ripple effect where it just gets worse and worse and worse with time when things came out of order. I'm surprised that you don't think the order is really important.
So Sam, I would argue that time is the missing commits, not necessarily the order, and the rate at which we're keeping up with the backport. So you were backporting 1.3 to 10, right?
Yes.
So 10 right now has a backlog of about 2,000 or 3,000 commits.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is that again, I mean, these things are difficult to prove, but what I went back, so yeah, obviously the commits being missing is what made TLS 1.3 land. But when in attempting to find the missing ones and land the missing commits, those missing commits themselves wouldn't land unless they landed in a particular order. And then they depended on other commits that also wouldn't land.
Yep.
So it kind of, so I have this overwhelming impression that yes, I mean, the proximate, like the first order problem is the commits just aren't there. So obviously the conflicts, but landing them is hard when they don't come in order. So and it's one of the things I think Bethany just alluded to this is that it's a little bit hard to experiment. Like it's hard to know for sure unless somebody goes through the effort of either redoing 10.x, like not redoing and releasing, but like reattempting to land it, but everything in the right order, which is such a massive undertaking. Nobody's going to do it, I don't think. So I'm curious to try and experiment. Like I think it would be interesting to try landing in order.
So I think that there's a premise here that that's being missed is we, as much as possible, attempt to land in order from the beginning.
Well,
Beth Rubin's here as an attendee and is looking to get promoted. So Sam, when we're generally doing backports, we're making a list of all commits that haven't been backported, and we are backporting them in order. The only thing that's not landing in order is when things don't land cleanly and require backports, and then those land out of order.
And some minors.
And some minors, yes.
So I guess
but I mean, and I don't want to be too hard about this, but as long, like I am extremely strongly -1 on regular sem minors for LTS. And there's no way that I see to reconcile that with landing everything in order, including minors, because of the way in which we handle current.
Okay, so we shouldn't confuse the two things. I mean, to me, it's like there's two things going on. One is, so whether or not it makes things landing in order, it makes it better or not, it's not worth talking about right now, maybe because you just don't like the idea of some minor LTS releases every time.
Yes.
Okay, so I think it would be interesting to gather more data on that. My impression, and we all see different parts of the node world, is that people are definitely reluctant to upgrade, which is, and just basically don't unless they have to if they've got running code. And I don't see that as being depending on the specific version. I think those type of what I've seen of those very conservative users is they just don't unless they're forced to.
But I guess I'm talking more about the issue of managed runtimes and downstream people who release Node, not just the people who are maintaining their own production applications.
Right. Okay, so fair enough. One thing I think maybe we should be clear on is, do we believe that some miners are more risky than others? Because I don't.
I believe from having seen it when I've backported them, that Semver miners are more likely to have bugs and errors because they are new, and giving them a couple months to bake and find the errors. I've very rarely seen Semver miners get backported that do not come with a handful of tail commits that are fixing up the edges of that Semver miner that were discovered over a handful of months afterwards.
Right. So I can see that. One question, does it matter? Given that it's a new feature, it won't destabilize anybody's app because they weren't using that feature.
I think so, because there's a stability claim that we make with LTS. We shouldn't be adding things that are not stable.
Okay, let me ask just one last question then, just so that I can gauge the temperature of what's going on. Do you believe I believe that the difficulty of maintaining LTS and the growing backlog, unless we physically just throw more bodies at it, I'm not sure that would even help. Like, it strikes me that it gets harder to maintain the LTS inactive fairly quickly. And all of the commits that are supposed to land, like there's what is it, a few thousand backlog right now. It's just, it's too large. So I'm interested, I'm wondering whether or not either the policy for what should land should change, or technical measures such as trying to land things in order, always landing Semvers in order, etc., could be approached. But if there isn't a consensus that there's a problem, then attempting any solutions doesn't make any sense because there's no problem, so there's nothing to solve.
So my impression from having done the work, Sam, the backporting, over 70% of the commits do not have conflicts. So the problem of like finding the time and handling the backlog is not growing due to conflicts or due to things not landing. It's literally just the amount of time that it takes to triage with our current process. So I do not believe that landing in order would affect that at all. That is a time thing. One thing that Beth and I had discussed as another alternative is we do have the LTS watch label. One thing that we could switch to would be we only land things that have LTS watch labels on them. And we only audit for commits that have had that added and no longer just audit the entire backlog, which is in a way actually maybe the opposite of landing in order because it would mean landing significantly less. But to be honest, that is how things started with LTS. It originally was we only backported the things that had that label on it, and the onus was on collaborators to label the things that they wanted backported. And I took it upon myself to go and backport the entire backlog specifically to make it so that it would be less likely that things would have conflicts. In your experience with TLS, for example, would happen less frequently because that was happening more frequently when there was less commits that had landed. So another alternative that we could look at would be having smaller LTS releases and only backporting things that are labeled.
So And there are multiple things here that you are discussing at the moment, as it seems to me. And I, for example, had a different experience when it comes to backporting. So when we have out of order commits, I ran into some serious problems backporting something else, because and then there was a manual backport of something. We actually had to revert multiple commits to then land commits in the correct order afterwards again. So this is the biggest pain that I've seen, was out of order commits. Then about having a risk for landing Zenver minor or not, yes, there are definitely sometimes follow-up PRs to fix edge cases. I think that's fine, mainly for the reasons that Sam outlined about that it's still something new. And yes, we try to backport everything. We could go into a different direction, which is like a middle ground pretty much for both standpoints. And that is something, the only open pull request in the release working group. I have to update it. But it is pretty much exactly that, because what it is you have a Zenver miner each, let's say, at the moment it's every 3 months on the LTS releases, right? And when we release that, afterwards, the next release would be a patch release, and then another patch release, and then a Zenver miner again. The important part is that the second Zenver miner would not build on top of the former patch release, but it would have a separate branch which includes the correct commit order of all the others in between. That would then allow to have the correct order again, mostly, and still allow to have patch releases. I cannot tell if patch releases really have a huge benefit or not. I only know that our backports themselves, the manual ones, we do mistakes there as well. Like I've often seen conflicts where we had empty commits, and that's something weird. Empty commit should never happen when we backport something, and that happens relatively frequently when we have our out of order commits, because then people manually backport everything and they take it from the current top of the branch. When they take it from the current top of the branch, other commits are actually, they already changed the code in the meantime. And that means they are actually taking multiple changes from multiple commits at the same time, instead of using it only from the following commit. Can everyone follow?
I follow what you're saying, but Ruben, we have 3,000 commits that haven't been backported to LTS right now. And I think what you're experiencing is a localized problem to backporting specific things, but is not a general problem. And I think that I honestly believe that the solution that is being proposed is overcorrecting in a way that will significantly hurt the value of LTS. We cannot be doing regular minor releases on our LTS.
I mean, in this case, it's a little bit sad that, like we discussed that a lot on the summit. I don't know.
What I think would maybe make sense, Ruben, I do not believe that you have done an extensive backporting of commits for LTS before. I think that it may be helpful for you to go through the current process that we have and see where the pain points lie, and perhaps even help. I will nominate you to do LTS releases. I think help doing 1 or 2 of the LTS releases first may help you see why, like, I really personally do not believe that the optimization that you are suggesting will really help.
So which one, like backporting Zenver minus all the time, or doing it with the proposal to have different branches where you actually then have still Zenver patch releases?
I think even the different branches, I don't, like, it takes already so much time to manage what we have right now. Having to manage 2 branches and then switching between them at each Zenver minor release, it seems like creating twice as much work, or at least like 30 to 40% more work than we currently have. and we already can't keep up with the backlog. And to do that, the only advantage that it would create would be to save a bit of time in backporting minors, which, to be honest, backporting minors should not be the priority of LTS.
So I believe there is actually not only more work, but also less work at the same time. And we cannot completely tell, because we don't have the experience of doing it so far, if it would actually save time in the end, or if it would take more time. I believe it will save more time, because yes, we have two branches, but normally we don't touch them a lot. And we could automate a lot on that side. Like I would have only the minor as the regular branch, and then we could automate backporting the patch commits to the other branch.
How does that work? How does that work with the .x release branch, though? Like, we can't change the history of the .x release. So if we've been tracking the patch release against .x, and now we want to land the minor release, we can't just force push over .x. Like, we're going to have to then, cherry pick from the minor release onto the patch release?
No, we would have to force push over .x.
Yeah, and we can't do that. .x is a source of truth that's a consistent source of truth. We never force push .x.
But we do have the actual, like if we would keep the actual release branch, then we could use that. And no, actually we do have source of truth, and that's the tag. So we have the tag for the release. And with that tag,
a consistent source of truth that we have had in release is .x is a forward-facing branch that will never change, that teams that are doing releases and potentially even building their own releases that are patching things on top of us can be guaranteed that the .x release will always be a fast-forward branch. Breaking that is a huge break to commitments that we make downstream.
So can you outline the implications of a downstream?
If I'm a downstream consumer of a Node LTS branch and I'm floating commits on top of it, if we force push over the .x branch and I now go to rebase the commits that I've been floating on top, they may completely be different now, as opposed to like rebasing on top of a small set of known changes. If we force pushed for every single minor, there would potentially be thrashing like 1,000 to 2,000 commits in between releases, where that rebase now will have to rebase against thousands of commits instead of 100 or 150. It's a huge amount of extra labor that we're putting on external teams that are potentially floating things on top of our releases.
I don't know. Like in general, I would like to backport more, because like that's what people were also saying, and at least what I heard, like that they would like to use feature ABC. It's normally always they want to have, like when people come in, it's normally, hey, could this be backported? Could this be backported?
I have very rarely ever heard that, to be honest. And we probably have different experiences and different people that we're talking to. And perhaps what could be really useful here before we make explicit decisions is doing some more user outreach, talking to enterprises, talking to companies, talking to individuals, and finding out what their needs are for LTS before we course correct too much.
I'm fine with that. So what about we do a small small survey?
A survey could make sense. We could also do like user empathy sessions. There's the user and enterprise outreach groups that will help organize like group sessions. There's a couple different ways that we definitely could approach this. I also would like to encourage those that are offering new solutions to the space to pitch in and try to work with the current process a couple times to at least get a strong feeling for what you're trying to optimize.
So could I'd like to say something. So I'm not, yeah, I'm in favor. It would be good to get more outreach and stuff. I'd like to be clear that I'm speaking as someone not who works in Node Corp and merging stuff back and dealing with that. But speaking of someone who maintained hundreds, literally hundreds of NPM packages for Strong Loop and then later for IBM for a while, this is why why Semver miners going back helps me. So because our packages were used by enterprises, because enterprises are possibly risk averse to jumping over minors, but definitely risk averse to jumping over majors. We have many customers who are still on 8 and are like just now considering moving to 10. So our packages have to work as far back as the oldest LTS, and yet they also have to work on the newest node, or the current release. So what I did is I made sure that I always coded to the lowest possible common denominator. And at its worst point, that was keeping to 0.10 feature sets in language via JavaScript language sets, way past it when there were newer nodes. I think it was up to node 4 at one point. I probably have the numbers wrong, but I was still coding to 0.10 because anything that I published that didn't work on 0.10 wouldn't work for corporate customers who are still stuck on the oldest LTS. So that's why I am looking to move Semver miners back, because it allows a consistent API across all of the supported, like node supported versions, and allows me to publish packages that easily support all those without having to do, if defs based on node version or other horrible stuff. Now, I want to be clear, Miles. I'm not trying to override your concerns. I'm not going to try and push a real change for that. It's not my place. I'm not going to do that. I'm just giving this feedback. And I also, one part of me as well takes the exact opposite point of view, which is I kind of like that Semver miners don't go back. If TLS 1.3 never ends on 10, and people start asking me about TLS 1.3 on 10, I can be like, hey, listen, buddy, it's time to upgrade. 12 has been out for a while. Move on up. That's where you get the new features. I'm not so sure I'll be actually able to get people to move up, but I guess if the pressure is high enough, maybe they will. But anyhow, so that's why I'm looking for some reminders, and why it's not just why I think it's an interest to very stable corporate customers move the miners back.
I mean, one thing to level set that I think is worth remembering in all this, with doing one miner per quarter, which is what we've been trying to average, that means 1 out of every 3 releases is a Semver miner. So we already do have a fairly decent cadence. The issue is identifying the Semver miners and backporting them.
And how easy it is to bring the backports back. And there, again, I absolutely take your point. People doing LTS have the best feeling for what makes it better. But I guess I'm here because in an attempt to bring a miner back that I thought would be worthwhile, I started having to look at the things it depended on, the things it depended on, the things it depended on. Mm-hmm. And so I got the impression that landing more stuff in order, trying better to order things would make things better. You have more experience. That's not your experience. You and Bethany are doing the work, so I'm not, totally, that's your right to decide what best makes your lives easier.
Okay, so do you think the next steps on this would maybe to look at getting some feedback, whether that's via a survey or what, and then we can revisit it after we've got some feedback around miners and patches?
I think that's part of it. I'd also, Ruben, would you be interested in being nominated to help with LTS releases?
Yeah, I'm up for that. I actually had hoped that I could also already look at for my release, but I think there was only one since we spoke about it. So
you could probably pick up the next release, because I think Beth and I were talking about that. Beth has started backporting, but there's definitely room. Let me just look at the calendar really quickly. So the next release that we have, there's an RC that's supposed to go out on July 2nd. So, maybe that's something that you could take on if you wanted.
Let me have a brief look. So when do you normally start with those releases? Because they are actually open for a significant and longer time than normally what we do with the current releases.
Generally, the way we do it, there's the wiki, which has all the timelines. If you think about it from a cadence perspective, we cut a release, 2 weeks later we cut an RC, 2 weeks later we cut a release. So it's kind of rolling every 2 weeks. And then there'll be much more intensive testing in SitGim and multiple RCs as we catch problems and get them working.
Yeah.
Beth, if you refresh that page, I just fixed the double RC that we had there.
Okay.
And so, and just for example here, if you look at like our release cadence as it already is, we had a Semver minor in May, then a patch in July, and then another minor already scheduled for August. So, you know, it's a pretty reasonable cadence already of minors. The question is just making sure that those minors can land. Sam, it sounds like you had a pretty frustrating situation. I've definitely been there on some of the minors. My experience has been that those are more outliers than the norm in backporting things. But when it definitely gets bad and hairy, what you're also feeling is like from 10 to 12, there's been a lot of Semver major changes in crypto and a lot of churn. And the more churn that there is in subsystems, especially churn that relies on Semver majors, the more acutely we feel those as well.
Yeah, that could be the case. To be clear, my problems weren't. Yeah, it wasn't even landing the TLS13 stuff itself. It was I would go 3 levels back and be like, oh, that thing, which isn't even really crypto related, needs to land. Oh, yeah. It doesn't. Oh, why doesn't it pick? Oh, you know. But anyhow, I mean, and I'm not.
I call that code spelunking. I've been there. It can be really frustrating.
Okay. So in terms of this next release, Ruben, Manel, I think even Tierney all expressed some interest in figuring out, like, getting a feel for what we do to create an LTS release. I'm happy to block off some time in my calendar and kind of do what you used to do with me, Miles, and watch a bit of the process, and I'll talk you through how we go about it if that works for people over WebEx or Zoom or something.
So I could do the July 2nd one. I could start working on it on the weekend before.
Okay.
Or the August one.
Sure. Okay. I'll raise an issue. I don't know. I'll name it like release mentoring or something. And put up some times that I'm free. And during those times, I'll just start landing some backports. And if people want to join in, I'll turn my Zoom on and people can join and see what's going on. And if you can't make it.
Beth, do you think it might be good to just invite more people to the time that we already have blocked at 11 on Tuesdays?
Yep, that would work. If that time works for everyone.
So if 11 a.m. Eastern time on like every other Tuesday works for people, that's like a standing meeting that Beth and I have. Originally for going over backports, you know, sometimes we just use it to catch up and see how life is. But if that would be helpful for people, I still have some time I can donate as well.
Is the next one on the 25th, folks?
Pardon?
Is the next one on the 25th or the 2nd?
The next meeting is on the 25th. So Ruben, for yourself, if you were going to volunteer to take on this next release, what it would mean would be going through from now basically until the 2nd. And I don't know how many backports are already on the 10.x branch, but we try to get at least between 150 to 200 commits on that branch before the initial RC.
Mm-hmm.
But more works also. As we mentioned, there's a pretty decent backlog.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, it's similar to the current releases. It's just updating the staging branch.
The biggest difference from the current release is that we need to audit every single commit. You can't just auto land them. You need to review every commit and ensure that it should be on the branch.
Right.
Because even things that are patches sometimes are not appropriate. And we also need to measure every single commit on its likeliness to change behavior. And if it's likely to change behavior or cause unexpected changes, we also won't land them. So there's a lot of commits that end up not landing, even though they're Semver patch.
Do you have examples for it?
That's what we would do next Tuesday. Is we could go through and just do an audit session where like Beth can go through and just do some backports and explain why certain ones would land and certain ones wouldn't. And then what we could do if you wanted to do some stuff on your own time would be to then just like go through and audit your work, and we could pair on that also and just like audit the work that you've done and ensure that, you know, nothing landed that shouldn't. It's kind of, it's a bit of a pseudoscience, but like kind of once you get the hang for what makes sense and doesn't, you know, it does take about 3 times to 4 times as long as doing the current release, just because you have to go through and check every commit. But it does become a little bit more intuitive after doing it for a little while.
Mm.
You essentially just need to do a risk assessment for every commit.
Okay, sounds like we've got a plan around some of that, and are like been some issues, etc. around that. The last 2 items on the agenda was defining a word for all current releases. I think this has been open for quite a while. It's so that we can change our wording. I mean, we're stuck with active LTS and maintenance LTS for a while. Okay, so this is what would we call releases like Node 8 and Node 10, ones that are, and Node 12.
I mean, I thought the consensus was coming around supported as a word.
Okay. All right, I'll add a note to this pinging, just to ping it again and see if we can get people to agree. Maybe open a PR so that people can better comment on that and express their positive or negative.
Is there a reason they can't, as a group, just be referred to as LTS releases, or is this including current releases?
I think
This includes current.
Yeah.
It's basically what do you call something that's not end of life, and as a general group.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yeah, it seems like people are leaning on supported. I'm indifferent.
Okay. So we just open a PR on that one. And the last one is development kit and deployment kit releases. I think we had consensus on this a few meetings ago, and we were going to work with the build work group to see if they could spin up some releases without NPM for Linux platforms.
I would suggest that if we want to do something like that, that we may want to just check with the TSC first.
Okay. Is everyone generally think that's a good idea? I think there was a few requests for it up in this issue. I think they were quoting the size of NPM.
Yeah, so if I remember correct, we actually also discussed that before in the meeting, and we were like, okay, we would be fine doing something like that as long as the build team would do it. I think it's a good idea to also bring it to the TSC because it's probably something more fundamental. In this case, it was mainly about what could actually be removed from the binary as such. And the main part that we've seen is just npm pretty much, because what it could be replaced with is, for example, a small script, and that would allow to install different different installers.
Mm-hmm.
And then people could choose on their own what they want, and would reduce the amount of memory for the binary.
Yeah, I think we do provide that for Windows at the moment, so it'd just be trying to provide the same for all platforms.
Well, I would say though that kind of fundamental change to the release itself is beyond just release to make a decision there.
This would be in addition, just providing the option.
Okay, then the flip side of it would be, I think that if this kind of like small script to select releases is something that we are interested in landing, there has been discussion about interest in something like this for core as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And this, if we're going to release something like that, and it's something that core is looking into as well, we should definitely not start shipping something that's different than what core will eventually ship, or at least too different. So we should just at least make sure that we're in sync with what core wants to do.
Okay.
To make sure that we're not kind of setting a precedent that's not in line with the direction that core would be going, because it could get confusing.
Okay. Sure. Next steps on this one, what would you think?
Maybe start a thread with the TSC about it.
Okay. There's not a massive demand for it. It was just something that's been on our backlog for a while, with a couple of users requesting it. So
yeah.
Okay. We'll look at maybe mentioning it to the TSC or bring it a thread there. Okay. That's everything on the agenda. Is there anything else anyone wants to speak about or mention?
Yes, so on the wiki, there is a security release date reserved for the 25th. Sam, do you have any outlook as to whether we will need to have a release on that date or not? I mean, it was reserved for security releases that were not critical. I was wondering if things like the OpenSSL upgrades in progress would count as that sort of thing, or if we think that date isn't actually going to be needed this time around.
I haven't found anything to release on those dates, and the OpenSSL releases will be just, they weren't the kind of things I was thinking of, and I'm trying to get more security related stuff moved into the normal release stream process.
Okay.
Have to be handled as special things with CI lockdown and all of that stuff. So, I mean, whether or not the release team would like to make patches, like, I guess I would leave it as a release. I don't personally see any reason to release the OpenSSL updates all alone in their own releases on those dates. And I haven't heard anybody else say that they think there is a reason to do that, but it's possible that maybe, Miles, you might have a better feel for that in the history.
Sorry, can you repeat the question one more time?
So I was thinking that there might be some kind of some batched private security fixes that we could kind of collect them all and release them at a particular predetermined date, because I'd seen that happening in the last couple of security releases. However, this security release looks empty, like there is nothing waiting to come out on the date we reserved. Yeah. There's
generally what we've done is, like, we have reports, and for certain things like, low risk DOSes or like things that are very low risk, we let those kind of bundle up until we have enough, and then we plan a release. I think this was the first one where we had kind of picked a date in advance, but I can't speak too much about what is and isn't embargoed, but as far as I know right now, like, there isn't really much in a backlog that's embargoed right now. That was part of the reason why we initially kind of took that approach rather than a regular cadence, because doing a security release for just one thing can be kind of disruptive, especially if it's not like a high risk vulnerability. But maybe that's something, maybe what we should do is do like a separate out of band private meeting between the security triage team and the release team to kind of get on the same page about that.
Yeah, maybe we should. I mean, I'm guilty of originally suggesting kind of a release cadence for security, but based on the last couple of security releases I saw, where there was something big enough that it was forcing a security release, and I saw that then made some people be like, oh, okay, let me finish up my low priority stuff and get it into that sec release. So I was thinking that by pre-planning one for this, end of June, that might have the same effect of a couple of the like embargoed low priority stuff would kind of get tidied up. But that didn't happen. So I'm okay with actually just dropping the idea. It doesn't seem to have added any value. So back to as things were is fine by me.
Very cool. Well, I mean, anything I can do to help support there, just let me know.
And in the short term, yeah, I don't see any reason for the OpenSSL releases, which are public to the world. There is a couple of CVEs so low priority that OpenSSL themselves didn't even release a new version of OpenSSL. They just kind of waited till they had their next regularly scheduled patch update, and then they bundled a couple fixes in. So I think treating them just in the normal release stream is the way to go.
Okay. I think that's everything on the agenda. Anything else you want to mention before I end the meeting?
There was the discussion about actually having regular meetings still every 2 weeks. Is this still something that we should find a conclusion, or was it already discussed properly in the issue itself?
Well, this meeting's we've had 6 people here today, which is probably the most we've had in a while. So if this meeting time works, I don't think anything's been resolved. I don't know, we just have to monitor how the attendance goes over the next couple of meetings. But I can keep it at 2 weekly for now.
So because what I suggested was, actually I like how the TSC does it at the moment, with having in the schedule every, in this case, every week for the TSC, but let's say every 2 weeks still, just to keep it. And we could cancel it if we say there's not really anything to talk about, like up to 2 days before.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, I can ping the people who have added the release agenda to the items and see if they feel like they still need to be discussed on the release call before the meeting. And if the answer is no, then if we've got no agenda, then maybe we can cancel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We can look at doing that. Okay, I think that's everything. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Speak to you later.
Bye.
See you around. Bye.
Don't